Welcome to Heart of Poland. Now, the day in which this episode goes live is the week in which the Warsaw Uprising ended. But the story would continue for the thousands of people evacuated from Warsaw, or still even remaining in its ruins. We're going to talk to historian Alexandra Richie about that subject. So Alex, thank you very much for joining us. And it's a personal privilege for me because your book, Warsaw 1944, Hitler, Himmler and the Crushing of a City, has been one of the books which I've really used to learn the story of the uprising. And of course, it's available in Polish as well. Would you agree with me that a lot of attention is put on the 1st of August, but not quite so much on, say, the remainder of the battle and its ending? And I'm talking about the way that, say, Poland remembers the uprising.
I think it's true. I think it's probably true of most historical events, actually, because after all, the uprising went on for 63 days, and people, commemorate the beginning of this tremendous tragedy, and the violence and the terrible things that happened. But to continue that for 63 days is for people who aren't particularly interested in history. Why would you do that? Having said that, I think that there's so many things that happened during the uprising, because of course it was crushed section by section in the city, and so each one had its own dramatic beginning and end as well. And as you mentioned, the end of the uprising was dreadful, terrible, because not only were people evacuated to Pruszków and so on, but then Hitler ordered the decimation, the crushing of the physical remnants of the city as well. And those people who survived in the ruins, many were caught, many were killed. So it was a tragedy and violence that continued many days and weeks and months, indeed, after the uprising ended.
Can you give us a kind of sense of the strategic picture as we go into the end of September and the nights start getting a bit colder, and people are just wondering how long can this go on for? Because it just seems to go on for extraordinary, really. And obviously, we're asking you to talk about many different battles. As you've said, you've got Mokotów, Żoliborz, and things like that happening. But what does the picture look like in Warsaw as we go into the end of September?
Well, again, I look at the uprising very much from the perspective of the Germans, what they did and what they were trying to accomplish, and it really was a sort of a patchwork quilt of we get this bit, then we get this bit, then we get this bit. So when you're looking at September, you're looking at the crushing of the Old Town, for example. Old Town was really almost like a medieval fortress, huge thick walls, population trapped inside, Hitler throwing everything he had at it, Karl mortars, the biggest mortars ever created, flights, bombing all day, with incendiary bombs as well as other types of explosive devices. And the train that was armored train that was just firing to the city. So you had the situation of a siege, this terrible siege, something like out of medieval tales. So that's the picture in September. And when the Old Town is finally crushed, then the Germans, I wouldn't say they relax a little bit, that's the wrong phraseology, but they realize that they're going to be able to crush the city, because once the Old Town goes, it's then almost more of a kind of mopping up operation. And the population is getting more and more desperate. As you say, the weather is closing in, it's starting to look toward winter, the food is getting short. In some parts of the town, people are starting to starve, eating rats and cats, and oh my goodness, dreadful things happening. So a sense of desperation starts to creep in, certainly to various areas of the city, I'd say.
So the talks with the Germans, the talks between the Germans and the Poles, has been going on, I think, quite a long time, really, during the battle. Were called off and then brought back to the table again. I mean, first of all, it seems almost extraordinary that there was still a will to carry on fighting, when strategically speaking, it was very obvious pretty early on that the battle couldn't be won, at least based on the objectives that were set at the start. So what do you think explains this 63-day battle? Because anyone sensible would say, hey guys, let's call this off. We're seeing the destruction of a city.
Well, I think part of the problem was this hope that the Soviets or that the Western Allies were going to come to their aid. So that was certainly the original idea behind the uprising was, you hang on for 3 or 4 days, and then the Allies are going to come in and help you. And there were people in the fighting who believed that was so, really right up until the end, until the final collapse. And so that was one of the elements of the continuation of the fighting. And then, again, the way in which the Germans crushed the city was part of it. What are you going to do? I mean, give up to Germans who at the very beginning were killing all men, all women, and all children? How do you capitulate to an enemy like that? It was only the vile Erich von den Bach-Zaleski, despicable man, but he had obviously very other interesting ulterior motives because he wanted to have a life after the war, which he did achieve. But he did start this negotiation with the AK, and in the end, the Komorowski didn't trust him, but agreed to this capitulation. But what would you do if you were in the old town? I mean, how do you give up to an enemy that's basically said they're going to kill you all? I mean, it was a terrible, terrible situation. It was a terrible dilemma.
So, did the Poles eventually surrender, or was it a capitulation or a cessation of hostilities? What did that actual agreement look like?
It was an agreement, so which was negotiated between representatives of the AK and von den Bach. And they did agree to certain terms, and that, for example, the Poles were going to be treated, the people who were in the AK were going to be treated with the status of prisoners of war, which was very unusual. They had to, on the other hand, give in their weapons in an organized and orderly fashion. The civilian population was to leave the city, and there were all sorts of promises made which weren't kept. For the civilians. For example, a great number of them were sent off to camps, including places like Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. Others were sent to work, forced labor into the Reich, which was not part of the agreement. And then others were sort of simply expected to go and find some sort of place to live out in the countryside. But the city itself was to be emptied. So these things were agreed in these terms. And as I said, the Germans didn't hold up their end of the bargain in many cases. But nevertheless, the fighting stopped, fighting ceased.
So you've got this extraordinary moment, you describe it so well in the book, where this becomes almost a ghost city. It's emptied of people, the battle is stopped, and the streets are deserted, the graves are still there. It's just so extraordinary when you think about the colossal scale of the violence. Fun fact, my wife's grandfather was one of the soldiers of the Klinsky battalion who was there, left behind, about 320, I think you described them, to patrol alongside the German units. So he describes in his memoirs, which haven't been published, how he's walking down the road and they've got guys they were trying to shoot at, just the day before, and they're now patrolling together with weapons. When you look back at that agreement, and you see how the Germans behaved at the start and how it ended up, would you say, that agreement, in a way, the cessation or the surrender or the terms, in the end, it could have been much worse? Is that a fair thing to say?
Well, as I said, the Germans didn't keep to their terms, and if you were a civilian who ended up in Prushkov and then got sent to Auschwitz, I'm not sure that you would think that it was necessarily a good thing. But I mean, as you mentioned earlier, the situation really was hopeless. The Soviets did not come and help. The Western Allies obviously didn't either. And what was the alternative? And, for those people who did survive, who did go through Prushkov and so on, it was the end of this horrific, terrible, violent fighting. There were, of course, those who were still hiding in the city, the Robinsons, they were called. Vladislav Spielmann's book, The Pianist, is a brilliant recounting of what it was like to be hiding and having to go from building to building as the Germans took over. This dreadful decision by Hitler to blow up the city street by street, which meant that those people who were in hiding were discovered and killed. I mean, so yes, it was a cessation of the terrible violence, but the violence continued and the brutality continued.
The book is subtitled, at least in the English version, Hitler, Himmler, and you've been very clear that you wanted to look at it from that perspective.
Yes.
And it really comes across the demented hatred that Hitler has for Polish people and particularly the capital.
Yes.
Hence this ludicrous decision to go and destroy this already destroyed city,
yes.
whilst the Soviets are sitting across the river.
Yeah.
How much of the city was destroyed during this period post Warsaw
Uprising? I mean, it's difficult to know exactly, but around about 30% of the buildings that were... So a lot of the buildings were damaged, or partly destroyed during the uprising, or even during the bombing in 1939, which people forget about the violence then. So it's difficult to put an exact figure on it, but certainly around about 30% of buildings, public buildings, schools, hospitals, and so on were destroyed, deliberately destroyed, with this sort of street by street destruction squads, sappers and so on that went in to mine and explode the rest of Warsaw.
You first came to Warsaw, I think, in '86.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And did you see the traces of that?
Oh,
that
very much
battle?
so. Very much so. That for me was one of the things that sparked my interest in this. This is, after all, one of the European great capital cities, and before the war was an extraordinary place and it had been very beautiful. And there was this certainly on the outskirts of Warsaw. I mean, the center around the Palace of Culture and so on, the sort of post-war communist architecture had already sprung up. But certainly when you took the train in, you could see all sorts of, sort of derelict sites and bomb sites and so on, still even in 1986. And even today in Warsaw, if you go around to some of the back streets and side streets, you can still find places that, for whatever reason, haven't been rebuilt, and they still have the scars of the war there.
Why did Hitler hate Warsaw and Poland? Basic racism?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, Hitler had various categories of hatred of different peoples. The Jews were the absolutely worst #1 enemy for Hitler, and he considered them to be, non-human and therefore were all to be exterminated. And had he won the war, that's what would have happened. But he had almost as much hatred for the Slavic populations of Europe. And Poland and Germany had a very long and twisted and difficult history. And that fed into his hatred, into his views. I don't think that people really realized that the violence with which the Germans invaded Poland. And in fact, the irony, of course, was that so many people I interviewed and talked to over the years said, well, the Germans are coming, they're quite civilized, they're going to be okay, because they were okay in World War I, or they were better than the Bolsheviks or whatever else. And so the shock that a lot of people felt here when they were treated this way was unbelievable. And of course Hitler and Himmler and his cohorts came into Poland with the express aim of decapitating Polish society. So if you were a priest, or if you were a educator or a business person or a politician or whatever, you were basically to be killed. And then the rest of the population could be enslaved and have an education up to the age of 6 or whatever, so you could count and basically be of service to the Germans. But that was going to be your role. And that hatred of the Slavs and that violence continues in spades when the Soviet Union is invaded. The brutality of the Eastern Front against not only the soldiers fighting, but the brutality against civilian populations in that part of the world is something so horrific that, despite the fact that I spend my life studying it, I just still can't get my head around it.
There were indeed many moments when I reread the book recently where I had to actually put it down just for a moment, because I could not read what you were presenting. And obviously you're doing it for a reason, which is you're trying to show what the conditions look like there. It must have been emotionally very difficult to write this book.
Horrific. And as I said, it's Warsaw Uprising is one of many such incidents that occur east of Berlin. But talking to the people who went through this, reading the memoirs, reading diaries, talking to people who saw their children shot in front of them, who saw their families destroyed, who saw their places that they'd spent their childhood just simply treated with such lack of respect, lack of humanity, was very, very difficult. And there were times when I literally couldn't read either. I just had to put it down, had to go away, do something else, and then come back to it. But yes, it's almost like a duty. One has to try and explain to the rest of the world what happened here. People do come to Warsaw now. It's a thriving, amazing, wonderful city. And some of those scars of the war are fading. But I think it was tremendously important to try and capture some sense of the tragedy and the trauma that this population went through. Both the Jewish population, which was treated so much worse, but also the population of Catholic Poles as well.
Let's talk about the Soviets then, because the very short version is, well, the Soviets were sitting on the other side of the river, which isn't technically true up until a certain point, and did nothing to help. Did Stalin help in any way? And I'm asking this, I know a little bit of this history, I'm looking at it from the point of view of someone who doesn't really understand the history. Why didn't they attack? They sent some soldiers over, so it's all a bit mixed and murky. It allows Stalin to say, well, I did land some soldiers on the Western Bank. What does that look like from the start, from the Soviet perspective?
Well, the short answer is that this was very convenient for Stalin because, you know, the AK, the Home Army in Poland, represented exactly the Poles that he didn't want to have to deal with when the war was over. He'd already, from the beginning of the war against the Soviet Union, 41, was already talking about the territorial acquisitions that he had in mind, you know, the Baltic states and, you know, bits of Poland and so on. He already had in his mind that this was going to be part of the Soviet empire, or at least sphere of influence, or whatever you want to call it. And who were going to stand in his way? Well, precisely people like the Home Army, the representatives of whom were based in London, which was, you know, part of the capitalist West. I mean, you know, so this was a political decision as much as a military one. Also, he used, of course, the excuse that there had been battles around Radzymin-Wołomin in that area, which had given the Soviets briefly a bloody nose. Was very useful for Stalin to say, well, I couldn't go to Warsaw on the 1st. We know from his own generals that he probably could have gone forward on around about the 17th, 18th of August, and he decided not to. And as you mentioned, he did do, you know, a few things as sort of sop to Churchill, landing some soldiers on the other side of the river who were obviously second-rate and were never intended to succeed, dropping some supplies so close to the end of the uprising that they had really very little impact. But yeah, it was a political decision, largely.
And of course, they are finding former soldiers of the Warsaw Uprising as they do move into Poland. What are they doing with the Home Army, the Red Army? What are the NKVD doing?
Well, the interesting thing is that at the very beginning, when the AK are fighting alongside the Soviets in places like Lvov or wherever, the actual soldiers themselves get along extremely well. They respect one another and so on. But then the NKVD shows up under orders, of course, and they start arresting these AK soldiers. And again, this is a political choice by Stalin and Beria and the others to decapitate the elite of Poland. So the Poles suffered this process under the Nazis, and they also suffered it under the Soviets. And the AK soldiers were arrested, interrogated. Some were sent to the Gulag. Some were killed outright. Some were allowed to return to Poland, but were kept under surveillance. Those who were POWs in the camps in Germany very often chose not to come back to communist Poland because they knew that they would be in danger because many of their comrades in arms had been arrested or disappeared. So it was a travesty, really.
What about the mass robbing of Warsaw? Because you again described this in the book as they're not just blowing buildings up; they're actually ransacking.
Oh yes,
the city.
Absolutely. The venality of the German occupiers here, all the way through the occupation, was simply unbelievable. Not just in Warsaw, but all through the area. I mean, the property, not just real estate, but also possessions of any kind, were there for the taking. Of course, this all had to be done under certain rules and regulations. You couldn't, as a Wehrmacht soldier, walk into somebody's house and start taking these. Oh no, then you were in trouble. Then you'd be reprimanded. But if you were requisitioning, or if you had permission from the SS or from whoever it was in charge, you could take houses, you could take property, you could do all sorts of things, and trainloads and trainloads and truckloads of goods were looted from Warsaw, both during the occupation period, but also during and after the uprising. People sort of lining their own pockets, taking valuables, paintings, all sorts of things that disappeared into Germany and German hands. Dirlewanger, for example, one of the most brutal thugs who was in the SS here in Warsaw, had a whole barn full of loot, which was discovered after the war. I mean, dreadful.
And of course, that's never found again. I assume there's most of the stuff that's robbed just disappears into the ether.
It disappears into the ether, yes.
Who got punished for the Warsaw Uprising? We're talking about genocide. Genocide of in an urban setting, at least, in a scale never seen before. I think in the Second World War, incomparable sense. Somebody must have been held to account for this.
No, unfortunately, there was very little punishment for the Warsaw Uprising. And in fact, some of the worst criminals, like Hans Reinefeld, ended up going back to West Germany, having a lovely life, becoming a member of the Bundesrat, a mayor of the island of Sylt, and died in his bed peacefully. Erich von den Bach-Zaleski turned witness for the prosecution at Nuremberg. and was never prosecuted for his activities during the uprising. Dirlewanger was murdered at the end of the war, so he was never brought to punishment. But this story was true all the way through at really every level. Very, very few people were punished.
The more you learn, the more it just becomes harder and harder to bear, doesn't it? Well, Alex, thank you very much for sharing the story of the end of the Warsaw Uprising, and I do highly recommend your book. I'm on record as being a fan, but it is, in my opinion, the best way that you can find out about the scale of the battle from its beginning to its end. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining this episode of Heart of Poland, and you can see some of the other fascinating discussions we've had with experts and historians about the Warsaw Uprising and other stories relating to Poland's history on the First News channel, wherever you find it. You can also find a lot of fascinating conversations with fascinating people leading fascinating lives in Poland. So I'll see you again for the next episode.